Now, even more interesting than all this, there's actually a very powerful gambit, which is one of the most credible gambits of all the gambits. So d4 knight f6, c4 c5 d5, and using that other idea I mentioned about undermining these pawns with b5, b5 can be played immediately. And there's some controversy over the name of this gambit, if it's to be called the Volga Gambit over a river, named after a river, or after Pal Benko, who was a very strong US player who played it a lot in his games. So, I don't know, let's call it the Benko Gambit. So, b5. So, basically, you know, black is potentially getting a lot of counterplay after c takes a6, and if white accepts this pawn, bishop takes a6, and there's tons of theory again in this. So the Benko Gambit, though, is, you know, one of the long established gambits which is known to give black, you know, a lot of queenside counterplay, first of all, in that semi-open b file, and also the bishop, when it fianchettos, again, it's got nice targets, and, you know, white's pawn on d5 can be held up. So the Benko Gambit, you know, offers tons of counterplay, and, you know, is a great opening in its own right. So it stems from that, you know, initial Benoni style provocation, this c5, provoking that white pawn forward. Let's also now look at the Blumenfield Gambit. So basically the Blumenfield is for example, d4 knight f6, c4, and not c5 immediately. So e6, and here white plays knight f3, then c5 d6, sorry, c5 d5, move b5, and after takes here, black's compensation is slightly different now after d5. Black's got this nice pawn centre, and there was a classic game of Alekhine where he won on the black side. So black's aiming for different compensation here, just more central control and use of this semi-open f-file potentially later. So that's the Blumenfield Gambit, which is again, you know, a very aggressive, you know, system. So there's different types of compensation from the Benko Gambit. Let's now look at the Schmitt Benoni. So d4 knight f6, knight f3, c5, d5, g6. So the Schmitt Benoni, how does this differ from everything else? Knight c3, bishop g7, e4. So this is a bit of a relative of the Perk defence. If you know your Perk defence theory, which by the way John Nunn did as well, you know, he knew the Perk inside out. So you know, white has slightly different opportunities here because he doesn't have that pawn on c4. It makes a big difference in the position. So the Schmitt Benoni, which can transpose into a lot of lines in the Perk. There's a Benoni King's Indian hybrid system, which you could refer as a hybrid system, which is basically a cross between a King's Indian and Benoni, when after d5 and black plays d6, and now, you know, you're playing for g6 and bishop g7, so that's kind of crossing the King's Indian with the Benoni. The snake variation now, so that's d4 knight f6, c4 c5 d5, e6, knight c3, so you take on d5, and then you use that d6 square not for a pawn but for your bishop. You play bishop d6, and some of the strategic ideas of this is that, you know, later you can castle and use this e-file and maybe, you know, move this bishop back and take on c3, just weakening white's e4, or bishop e5 takes c3. So the snake can be quite dangerous. So that bishop just coming to d6, and so you're delaying, you know, you're putting that as an option to play d6 later when it's more favourable. So that's very interesting. There's also another one, a very nice nicknamed opening called the Vulture. So the Vulture, d4 knight f6, c4 c5 d5, now knight e4, so the knight swoops down like a vulture, and so if knight c3 you can just double white's pawns, But otherwise, if it's kicked, then here, knight d6, and you know, this looks as though, you know, what's black going to do against e5? Well, certainly not f6, but you can play here knight a6, and if white continues, then, you know, the knight can come out, you know, to d4, and white's been over-provoked with his pawns. These pawns can't go backwards. So the vulture is an interesting variation in itself. So f3 is not particularly hot. But also, you can just play queen a5 here. I think actually queen a5 is according to Ribka, marginally stronger than knight d6. So after knight d2, now you can play knight d6. You don't really want to take on d2 because then the bishop can come to c3 later. And in this position, like g6. So this makes it kind of awkward if white's knight's on d2. So there's plenty to be thinking about there in the Benoni variations. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.